As we move on in our accounts of God's revealing of himself to people and his encounters with humanity, we move on to Abraham's grandson. Abraham has died and his son Isaac has had two children, Esau and Jacob, twins who, even in the womb, Jacob was feisty and fighting with his brother and grabs his heel as they're being born. Esau was Isaac's favourite, but his wife preferred Jacob, and that's one of the great things about the Bible, is that we see the truth as it is. It isn't sort of tried to be smoothed out. It shows the faults of people as well as their successes, as well as their faith. It shows them as human beings. So here's Jacob, this heel grabber, and his name literally means deceiver. And he goes on to deceive his father, to steal the inheritance from his older brother. He cheats his brother and ends up with an angry brother, that Esau is out for vengeance. And Jacob runs away with his father and family's blessing. He's sent away to look for a wife. And he sets off on his journey and he begins to head back towards Haran, where his grandfather Abraham came from. And in effect, he's going back to where the story started. As he heads towards Haran, he stops for the night and he goes to sleep, and he has this dream of a ladder. You might have heard the story of Jacob's ladder. And he has this dream where angels are going up and down between heaven and earth. And this is the spot where God's presence is touching the earth. And in the middle of this, he sees this picture of God where God reveals himself to Jacob, and he reaffirms the promise that he made with his grandfather. He promises Jacob that he'll be with him. In other words, he's saying to Jacob that I promised that the presence of God will be with you and the protection of God with you. And when Jacob wakes up, he recognises this presence of God, and he recognises it as awesome, and he has this sense of feeling afraid, feeling fearful, respectful, and as a result calls the place Bethel. This is a pivotal point for Jacob, because in encountering God, he makes this decision in verse 20 to commit his life to God. Up to this point, Jacob's been this sort of wild child who's lived to his own sort of agenda. He's cheated, he's deceived, he's lived up to his name. And now here he is, running from his brother, afraid of what's going to happen. And he has this encounter with God that is just mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing for a number of reasons. Mind-blowing because he senses the holiness and the presence of God. And this encounter with God changes his life, because he decides that rather than living off of his father's reputation or living off of the coattails of his granddad, he has to make a choice for himself. He now has to accept that the God of his father and his grandfather is his own God. And I think often we try to live off the faith of others rather than realising we have to come to a place of acceptance for ourselves. He calls this place Bethel because there's such a sense of the presence of God that he's afraid to sin. And it's one of the hallmarks often of when God moves, that he calls his people to holiness, that sense of being afraid to sin because the presence of God is so real. Many years later, Jacob returns. In Genesis 35, we read that he returns to this place of encounter, Bethel. And as he does that, he purifies his household from sin, and God meets with him again, this time reaffirming himself as El Shaddai, exactly the same as he had to his grandfather, the God who sustains. So Jacob, having been running away for his life, now returns and looks back, and God says, I was the one who sustained you through that. Here in this place of encounter, here where it all began for Jacob, here where he had this life-changing moment where he committed himself to God and God promised to be with him and has been faithful, and God meets with him again and reveals himself as El Shaddai, the God who sustains. God also gives Jacob a new identity. He affirms an identity that he'd begun to develop a few chapters earlier, but says no longer will Jacob be known as the deceiver. Instead, he's now going to be known as Israel, the one who contends with God, the one who wrestles with God. This encounter with God shows us that for all the mistakes and failings, when we come into a relationship with God, personally for ourselves rather than living off of others' beliefs, God can give us a new identity, a new direction and a new start. And I wonder if that's something you're hungry for.